What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Stronger TV. As always, I am Kiefer Lammy here with Dan Pope, and today we're talking about a topic that I think comes up for a lot of athletes in their training. We're talking about pain in the front of the shoulder. So this could be with bench pressing, it could be with overhead pressing, it could be with Olympic lifting, but I think what we find is that a lot of people have it, maybe for a couple different reasons, and they don't really know how to go about making it better, right?
Yeah, this topic is near and dear to my heart, Put a lot of thought into this. But yeah, it's probably the most common thing I treat on a regular basis. It's probably the most common injury I see in the gym, you know. This is going to go for people that are doing powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, a lot of CrossFit, general strength training. It's that pain that's kind of in the front of the shoulder here. Like Kiefer said, it can hurt during things like bench press, overhead press. It can hurt in the bottom position of a snatch. A little bit of pain right through the front here. It's usually either through the front or kind of on the side. Where do you end up seeing this in the gym?
I think more often than not, I see it a lot with people right in the front of their shoulder. And a lot of times it comes with stuff like, a pressing variation or sometimes even rowing variations. And what it looks like visually to me is that they're just not in a good position, right? So whether the shoulder's dumping forward a little bit and they're not kind of getting tight, or they just don't have good control over what their elbow position is and they end up with a little pain.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So it's a big problem, and I think what is presented kind of in the social media world is sometimes a little bit inaccurate in terms of how to get better. So we see a lot of people are left very frustrated and they completely stop their training, or they stay away from upper body stuff, or they start doing a lot of different row variations. And I think the solution is a little bit more simple than that, right? And also, we need to make sure we're still loading it. So we're kind of show you how to do that so you can get better over the course of time.
Sure.
Before we go into that, I want to talk about what's probably happening when people have pain right in front of the shoulder, okay? And what I think is occurring when people have pain in front of the shoulder is some sort of irritation, probably to part of the rotator cuff, the top part of the cuff called your supraspinatus, maybe a little irritation to the biceps tendon or the bursa that lives right in this area, all right? So, in the world of physical therapy, we do research on exercise to see which exercises have the highest muscle activation of all sorts of different muscles, right? For the supraspinatus, the exercise that is going to have the highest EMG for that area is just going to be what's called scaption, or this motion right here, right? So that supraspinatus is working a lot. So what's the difference between this motion right here and this motion right here? It's very, very little, right? So when we press things overhead or press things in general, the rotator cuff is working a lot. And this condition, pain in front of the shoulder, what we call it some sort of rotator cuff tendinopathy or some sort of subacromial impingement syndrome, that pain that you're experiencing right in front of the shoulder is probably going to be an overuse issue from too much pressing. So it makes sense. If you're doing lots and lots of press exercises, we're just getting more and more stress to this rotator cuff tendon. If there's too much stress, it tends to kind of break down, right?
Sure.
The other piece is that there is an element of compression or impingement that occurs with pressing overhead. So when I press overhead, my deltoid muscle is very, very active. Okay, think about a lateral raise, overhead press. It's good for building big deltoids. When I press overhead, this muscle fires and actually pulls the ball upwards in the socket. All right. When the ball goes upwards in the socket, it gets closer to a little structure called your acromion right here, and it compresses the rotator cuff tendon, biceps tendon, and the bursa right in this area. So if I'm doing a lot of pressing overhead, it's stressing the tendon, it's squishing it, right? So what ends up happening is that when people come to me and they say, I have pain in the front of the shoulder, hurts when I press, it also hurts to go fully overhead because that compresses the tendon. It also hurts to come across the body and down this way, right? Hawkins-Kennedy test, as well as a Neers test. And going this way and coming up hurts. And all those things do, they just compress that tendon and are having a little bit of pain. So I think that's what's happening in the gym when people have this pain in the front of the shoulder. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think, what I get from this too is oftentimes we see that this is coming from one specific movement or something that somebody's doing too much of in the gym or too much of compared to what they're prepared for, right? But then what happens once, the area is pissed off is that everything else hurts. Right, because it's so involved in so many different motions, and I think that's where the frustration comes from is they think, oh my God, everything hurts, I don't know what I can do anymore, I need to stop training entirely, instead of figuring out like, all right, where is this coming from, how can I scale back, what can I build back up appropriately for it?
Yeah, I think it just really screws with your head because when your shoulder hurts and when you're training, it hurts, you're like, am I causing more damage, I need to stop all my training, like what do I do in order to get better,
Right.
So what you tend to see in the social media environment is a lot of people saying like, all right, let's incorporate a lot more rowing. Lots more row exercise is going to strengthen the muscle in the back of the shoulder, add more balance to the shoulder, and over the course of time your pain is going to go away and you'll do just fine, right? And I think that makes sense, right? But in terms of tendon problems, tendons tend to heal with direct stress, right? So a really good example is, let's say, Achilles tendinopathy or Achilles tendonitis when you have pain in the heel. If you go look onto PubMed and start doing research on Achilles tendinopathy, the major thing that helps with this is just stressing the tendon directly. So doing a calf raise will help heal this, right? But in the shoulder, we tend to think differently. Like, okay, so I have a tendon problem here. I'm not going to stress this tendon, but I'll stress everything else, and that's going to help. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
We kind of have to apply stress to that tendon so it gets better over the course of time. And if you go to a physical therapy office, what are we giving you? We're giving you Scaption, right? Because that directly stresses that tendon to make it feel better over the course of time.
Sure.
So we don't want to stop training, but we probably have to dial back a little bit and then slowly ramp up over the course of time. And that's kind of what we want to show you guys today.
Sure.
Right? Do you want to start with a few exercises to kind of talk about the modification process?
So I think before we even go into it, kind of the big concept for us on how to modify training and how to sort of rehab things back to where you want it, right, is we're taking your training and we're somehow scaling it back based on intensity, volume, range of motion, tempo, or sometimes the angle of it, right? So I think that's the big theme with this, is that we're always still training. We're still training the area pretty directly, right, but with some sort of modification to one or most of those variables.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
So how do you want to start off first here?
Well, I will say, and we'll go down the line. Before we go into that, I want to say that trying to find variations for pain with pressing is a little different, let's say, when someone has back pain and they're squatting, right? So it's pretty easy to say, when I go this way, when I have back pain, it's a little more stressful on my spine. If I go here, it's a little less stressful, right? It's not as cut and dry, so there's going to be a lot of trial and error, I guess, when you have shoulder pain, right? I think the easiest one for people to understand first is to shorten the range of motion.
Yeah.
We said when you have pain, you go through a full range of motion, those end ranges are going to create more issue. So what we do is just go through a partial range.
Yeah.
So first really good one for people who have pain, let's say with a bench press, is just to shorten that range a little bit. Maybe try a floor press.
Yeah.
So you can't quite go as deep here. Or maybe you're doing a board press, right? Just any sort of variation that's keeping you from that very end range of motion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for bench pressing, and this is one of the areas we see that sort of shoulder pain a lot with, right? The obvious one is we're going to probably go a little bit lighter in the short term, right? But then the next things for us is let's change your range of motion a little bit and sometimes play with grip width, right? Because we know that, just like you're talking about, if a full range of motion is going to take my elbows this far past and pull me this far into shoulder extension, that partial range is only going to get me to here, right? And some people will have relief for that, some people might not, right? On the flip side, you have people that, in their traditional bench press setup, their elbows are out pretty wide and they get some of that discomfort. Just by going to a slightly narrower grip, getting their elbows a little bit closer to their side, it totally changes the stress and they feel a little bit better. So kind of like you're talking about, we don't know what's going to be the perfect solution, but we know that these are some of the modifications that we can play with to see if it gives you, the relief you need so you can keep training and keep stressing that area.
You got it. Just to kind of go a little further with that topic you're just talking about. So if I have pain with a barbell, if I go to something like a neutral grip bar, it's going to bring my elbows in and it might actually feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
The other easy thing to do is that, let's say it hurts with a barbell, if I go to a dumbbell and just change my elbow angle, again, a little bit easier from that perspective. The other thing I will say is, let's say you have an overuse injury of the shoulder and you're typically a very tight presser with your elbows. Let's say you go a little wider, a lot of times that ends up feeling better too. So when we change this angle, what we might be doing is just altering the stress and unloading a very specific part of the tendon that's irritated so you can press without pain.
Yeah, and that's a topic that we talk about generally with a lot of things, right? Is, oftentimes specificity of training can lead to some, overuse related discomforts, right? So just by having variety in your training in general, right, whether it's different pressing angles or different squatting variations or whatever it is, tends to give you, one, a little bit better, like well-rounded strength in the area, but it tends to keep you away from some of those overuse related things. Right, so as far as programming goes, it's something we include a lot in early phases, and you see this a lot in our online training programs, right?
Yep.
But then we recommend this to even high-level athletes, at least in early phases, have way more variety, and then try and wait until you're getting a little closer to competition to make things super specific.
Yeah, you got it. I definitely agree 100%. I do want to talk a little about, we really hammered that bench press to death.
Sure.
I want to talk a little about overhead press,
All right?
So we said with overhead press, when you get to the very end, sometimes that's really painful for people. So what can we do to decrease the stress at end range? Do you have any good exercise you like, Keeper?
I think one of the biggest ones we use, and we already have it set up here, is to go to a landmine, right?
Yep.
But with the landmine, I think the other important thing to figure out is that we've also made another change, and that's going from bilateral to unilateral, right? So just like with bench press, where if we're fixed with a barbell, you're kind of fixed in a certain plane, right? Well, when you're overhead pressing, if we're using a barbell, we're fixed to one position, one shoulder angle as we go here. Just by switching to something unilateral, you give a little bit more degree of freedom for what your width is and how you kind of groove that pattern. So when we go to a landmine, just the same as if we were doing a dumbbell overhead press, we give ourselves that amount of freedom.
Yeah.
But then the second step the landmine press gives us is that we get to change the angle from being truly overhead to slightly out in front, and it kind of changes the mechanics and the stress for you.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And what I end up seeing a lot of times are either CrossFit or Olympic weightlifting athletes, and they can't press overhead, so it's like they're completely lost, right? But if you change the angle with something like a landmine press or a dumbbell press, you can get a great training effect, or even an incline dumbbell press. You can get a great training effect that's going to eventually carry over to jerks and continue training without having to drop everything. You want to try a few repetitions, just show the folks what we mean here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So the first thing you'll notice when Kiefer's pressing is that his elbow can stay a little bit more tucked to his side. So we're automatically changing the elbow position that you would have with a barbell. The other thing that we can see is that when Kiefer gets fully overhead, he's still not stacked straight overhead like he would be with a barbell. So this difference in range of motion is going to be helpful sometimes with people that have shoulder pain. The other piece is that we can have Kiefer lean into this as much as he wants. So we can have him going pretty much straight overhead this way, or we can go a little partial range of motion. So if someone's trying to get back to, let's say, jerks, I want to actually give them the variation they can handle that's as close to jerks as possible. So if they can lean forward and get very upright with their pressing, I'd rather them do that as opposed to going to this variation, because if this is tolerated plus this is tolerated, this is a little bit closer to jerks, and I want to continue working towards that person's goals.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's perfect. No, I think that's great. I think, we talk a lot about activity ladders, right? And staying as close to something as you can. Well, the landmine press gives you an opportunity to have like an activity ladder of its own.
Yep.
Right? Because you can scale it appropriately as you go, either from rep to rep if somebody's feeling good with it, or from week to week and say, hey, we changed angle this much, we're that much closer to being fully overhead and being stacked up over your ear.
Yeah, you got it. I like that. I want to talk a little bit about tempo. Also talk about sets and reps and intensities. One of the things before we get into that, a very common thing you'll find with people that have shoulder pain is that it doesn't really hurt very much until they get towards their maximal lows, right? So let's say if an athlete is supposed to be working up to a 3-rep max in the bench press, and actually feels really good until they get to 85 to 90% of their 1-rep max,
Yep.
right? So for that athlete, they feel like they can't train because whenever it gets heavy, they just can't tolerate it anymore, and it's very frustrating. So what are some things we can do for that athlete that, say, is load intolerant, that can't handle those high percentage of their 1-rep maxes?
Well, I think the obvious one oftentimes is just go a little bit lower, right? Find what that threshold is, stay just below that intensity level, and you just accumulate volume there.
Yep.
Right? And so what I would do is I would spend a lot of time accumulating volume, and then every once in a while trying to test those limits with very small amounts of volume, right, at a higher intensity. Mm-hmm. If things go well the next couple of days and you don't have any pain, awesome. Let's start to keep introducing a little bit more of that. If it's not going so well, we'll just keep building more time there.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you have to be creative with, maybe you're hitting higher intensities with a slight variation, so you still get that intense stimulus. Right? Maybe sometimes you're making something be perceived as a higher intensity because you're changing the tempo of it or something else that makes it more challenging.
Yep.
But I think that's something we see a lot is it's just purely the high intensity work isn't feeling good for people.
Yeah, you got it. And if they're using some of these variations, you can still get a good training effect. Maybe you're not going quite as heavy as you'd like, but you're still working the same muscles, you're still working on hypertrophy, you're still working on technique, all the stuff that can help you improve in the long run.
Yeah.
The other thing you can try sometimes, let's say 5-rep maxes and heavier just don't feel good. Let's take the reps and just take it down to, let's say 8 to 10, or take it up, to 8 or 10.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you have that load intolerant shoulder that's still working on strength, still working on hypertrophy, and all you did was change the amount of repetitions.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we've already beaten to death is just changing the tempo, right? So a 5-rep max with a 3-second tempo and a pause at the bottom of a bench press is going to be a completely different load as a 5-rep max when you're going as fast as possible. And someone who's load intolerant, they use lighter loads to the tempo, and they can automatically kind of train without much pain and improve over the long term.
Right.
That.
Yeah, I think, both through going to higher rep ranges, right, and by slowing down the tempo, we add more time under tension. Yep. And not only is that going to be good for hypertrophy and building strength, but that's probably going to be good for building some resiliency in the tendons and the structures around it without being so intense that it's starting to piss it off a little bit.
You got it. The other thing I tend to do with people in the rehab process is I change their frequency. So let's say you normally press 3 to 4 times per week, which is quite a bit. I'll take them down to, say, let's maybe take that down to 1 to 2 times a week, work there for a few weeks, then introduce 2 to 3 times, right, and then maybe 3 to 4 times over the course of the next few months to work your way back into the high pressing volume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we talk about this a lot, and we've used it on the whiteboard before, and we talk about kind of like how you fill your bucket of your training, right? And a lot of times the people that are having these overuse related injuries, their bucket's full almost to the brim with really specific or really intense training, right? So what we try to see is, all right, how can we keep, the training volume as a whole just as high, but tone back how much of it is that really intense stuff?
Yeah.
right? So we're filling in with some, some more volume-related work, so it's lower intensities. We're using tempos. We're using different ranges of motion. We're filling in the gaps with even more accessory work, maybe directly impact that shoulder area, right? And our goal over time is to get back to that stuff, so that our bucket's just as full. We're not just going from, oh, I trained this much to now I can only train this much.
Yeah.
Right? It's just how specific those things are for the individual.
Yeah, I got it, 100%. One thing I want to talk about before we end up wrapping up is that there are certainly going to be people in the gym that their shoulder is so flared up they can't tolerate any sort of pressing, right? You may try every single modification in the book and it all kind of hurts, right? If that's the case, you can almost certainly go towards a row variation. Rowing is usually one of those movements that doesn't irritate the shoulder quite as much. If you think about your pulling muscles, so I think about my lats, so I'm doing a pull-up, I'm using my lats a lot, rows, lats, same thing is going on. The lats attach from down below up to the shoulder joint, and they pull the ball down in the socket, and they don't stress that supraspinatus tendon quite as much. So I'm creating more space for that tendon, plus I'm getting a strength training effect by training the upper body. Not the same as pressing, but it's something you can incorporate into your training to make your athletes feel like they still are going towards their goals and don't have to stop everything.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think, the one last thing that we haven't really touched on, I think this is kind of the case for some people, and, it's not just a case of scaling back volume and doing other things. There are some people that have true, mobility restrictions in their shoulder or their thoracic spine, and that limits their ability to get into a position regardless of what they're doing. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the example that makes most sense is that when you go to the end ranges of motion, it's a little bit more stress on the cuff. There's a little bit more impingement on those structures, right? A more obvious example is the bottom position from a snatch, because we have to be so far back, especially if we can't get upright in a snatch position, right? So if I can get more mobility coming from my ankles and my hips and my thoracic spine, I automatically stack up a little bit better. It's a little less stress on the cuff tendons. Same thing goes when you're pressing overhead. So if I don't have range of motion coming from my thoracic spine here, I end up having to do more motion from my shoulder joint. And you're forcing more of that stress to go through the shoulder as opposed to having motion from the thoracic spine and not working quite at the end range of motion as much.
Yeah. I think, if you go back to an earlier episode of Stronger TV, we talked a lot about evaluating overhead range of motion and mobility restrictions, right? So I think whether you're going to, see somebody that can evaluate you themselves, or you figure out how you can kind of look at these things on your own, it's important for you to determine, all right, is this just a volume issue, or am I actually limited somewhere that I need to make some adjustments to before I get back to this training?
You got it, right? Because, what you're hinting at, it sounds like to me, is that something hurt you in the first place. And a lot of times that's just a poor program.
Yeah.
So let's say that you want to press 3 to 4 times a week. Historically, every time you press 3 to 4 times a week, maybe you're tolerating it for a few months and all of a sudden you break down. Maybe 3 to 4 times a week is not the best thing for you.
Yeah.
Maybe you have to dial back, let's say, one day during the week, or maybe you have to use lower RPEs, or you have to implement some more bench pressing accessories or overhead pressing accessories that are less stressful on the shoulder. Something to modify your training over the course of time so we avoid this making progress, get hurt, go down, get better, make some progress, get hurt, go down. We want to make sure it's a nice, smooth trajectory forward. When you get hurt, it really keeps you from progressing in the long run. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I think that's all we have for today. We talked a ton about shoulder pain in the front of your shoulder, right, and the ways that you can kind of modify this. If you like this episode, make sure that you subscribe for future episodes, share it with your friends, and we'll see you next time.